to fight for. For those of you who don't know, I have autism, and I had difficulty with some things growing up as a result. There were 7 main things that I've had trouble with because of my autism, and I'll be talking about each one individually. I've also been writing stories about my struggles on Google Docs, and I've been sending them to 2 of my teachers in school. So far, I have written 5 of them. I hope it doesn't seem like I'm looking for sympathy in this video, because that's not true. I'm making this video because I like to talk about it, and I could possibly help anyone else with autism or any similar condition who can relate. Anyways, let's get started. Back in 2007, when I was just 1 year old until I turned 2 on October 10th, I was happy and well behaved. But in 2008, my mood changed, and I started to have problems with my behavior. 2009 to 2011 were the years I struggled with it the most. Every minor thing during these years would cause me to have severe outbursts. I'd rather not go into much detail on here about my behaviors, but I'll tell you that I would often scream at the highest volume you could imagine for long periods of time. I got into a lot of trouble in elementary school overall because of it, and my parents were concerned about how long I would behave like this for. There were many things that would trigger such behaviors, and a lot of them were because there were certain things that would bother me when people would do them. It would also make me lose control when something wouldn't go the way I wanted it to, like with many small children. Since then, my behavior got slightly better each year, although I went through one phase that lasted the last 3 months of 2013, in which my behavior was by far the worst it ever was. I'm glad I never went back to it ever since. One of the documents I wrote in school was all about that period of time. It was my 3rd one, and it was completed on April 19th of this year with the title, My Infamous Phase of 2013. But as I was saying, my behavior got slightly better every year since then, and nowadays I'm a completely different person than my old self. I made a few poor choices recently when I didn't control my feelings, but none of us are perfect. I know other autistic children who have difficulty with their behavior as well. There are still things that bother me nowadays that I mentioned bothering me before, and a lot of them are certain sounds that I didn't like and still don't like. And this brings me to my next struggle. Ever since I started having problems with my behavior, I also began to have sensitivity to loud sounds, as well as sounds that I found to be unpleasant regardless of the volume. I completed a document about this that I wrote in school on May 11th with the title, My Sensitivity to Sounds. I'm aware that it's normal for people who have autism to be sensitive to sounds, and I was the same way. My hardest year with it was definitely 2012, as there was a great variety of sounds that I was intolerant of, especially when they would happen when I wasn't mentally prepared for it. The sound that I've always been most sensitive to was screaming and crying. I've had a lot of problems with hearing babies and children scream and or cry, and I have felt very intense feelings of anger on many different occasions throughout my life when I heard it, which was quite hypocritical considering I used to do it all the time. I would even do it because I was upset that I was hearing it. Anyways, I was not only sensitive to sounds that were loud or annoying, but I also couldn't tolerate certain sounds that were always loud to me no matter what, because I had it printed in my head that it was a loud noise. In fact, I used to be unable to tolerate people sneezing or laughing to any extent. Other sounds that I was annoyed by or afraid of include dogs barking, elephants trumpeting, fireworks, any type of alarm, and people saying SHH, which still bothers me a lot if someone says it loudly. Because I couldn't tolerate any sound that was louder that I disliked, I had trouble going into certain places that I was likely to hear those sounds in. I've always had to wear earplugs in those settings. The feeling I'd get when I would hear these noises could be best described as imaginary internal pain. I've gotten much better with this problem since I was a young child, although I still have trouble with some sounds. Fortunately, I have a tip for overcoming this problem that my father taught me. The reason I'm so sensitive to certain noises is because they're in my head as a negative thing. If I try to get that out of my mind and think positively, I can overcome this problem. In addition to sounds, I also have trouble with being sensitive to words. And that's coming up now. In 2012 or late 2011, when I was in kindergarten, I learned that there were certain words that I wasn't supposed to say. I said some of them myself after learning them from somewhere, and an adult heard me and told me, "Hey, don't say that." But then in 2014, I started to get upset when I would hear swear words because I learned that swearing is a bad thing. In other words, I basically created a monster in my head, according to my paternal grandmother. I was mostly sensitive to the big one, the F word. You should all know what that one is. And I'll be focusing on that word in this story. I became more sensitive to the F word every year since, and it became a serious issue in 2019. What made me hate it even more was how overused it was, which still breaks my heart today. Other swear words like the S word and the B word would still bother me, but they didn't make me genuinely upset like the F word did, especially when I heard it unexpectedly. When I hear unexpectedly, it gives me an unpleasant, sudden feeling that I could best describe as going down a drop on a roller coaster. The year of 2022 had to be the worst year for it. Fortunately, this year seems to be my first year of redemption, although I definitely still have progress I need to make. The first document about my struggles that I wrote in school was about this. I finished writing it on January 18th, and I titled it, "The 4-letter word that affected my life." It's true that it did affect my life. I am more socially awkward because of it. I feel uncomfortable in certain places, and the word even ruined some of my days in the past few years. People have asked me before why sometimes I handle the word just fine and other times I'm highly affected. That's because there are 10 different things that make sometimes worse than others, and I actually have a chart of them all in my notes. For example, I have a more difficult time handling it if someone says it in a loud voice or an aggressive tone. Another example is if a nice person says the F word who I wouldn't normally hear it from. It has to be the worst when it's from a female friend, because it's not ladylike for a young girl to say it, and they're my friend. In fact, I've had bad thoughts before thinking I'll catch a female friend saying it or writing it one day, and I'll be extremely upset and have a panic attack afterwards. To overcome my state of being fragile to the F word, I should use the same strategy I stated that I'll use for my sensitivity to loud noises. And I also think I'm slowly overcoming it as a result of maturing physically and mentally. Overall, this is an example of the issue that once I get into something bad, I can be unwilling to or have trouble getting out of it. And that can be perfectly described for the next part. Here it comes. In 2006 and 2007, I would eat almost anything I was given, like a lot of babies. But unfortunately, in 2008, I came to an instant stop. Overnight one day, my mother tried to feed me, but I refused to eat my food. She soon came to realize that I wouldn't eat much anymore. I wrote about this struggle on my second Google document, which I finished on March 8th, and gave it the title, "The Change in My Versatility for Eating." 2010 had to be the year in which I was the least versatile with food that I've ever been. I would eat hardly anything. My parents were worried that I would stay this way permanently, like I said by problems with my behavior that I mentioned from the first struggle. But the same thing happened as with that one. Every year since I was at my low point in 2010, I started to slowly expand my palate every year. To be said with humility, I have made enormous progress. And my parents are impressed with how extensive my palate is today. But getting to where I am today with my eating habits was a bit of a difficult progress. Back in 2012, when I just started to eat more, I was too scared to try anything new. That would end up going through phases in which I would become completely obsessed with a particular food item, and I would overeat it to the point where I got sick of it. For a long time, there were also certain vegetables that I was afraid to eat because I was scared of trying many of them, but I eventually overcame that too. Overall, I'm glad that I have overcome all these eating problems. If you're a picky eater, you may be satisfied with having such a limited palate, but you can change one day like I have. I'm not saying you have autism if you're a picky eater, but that's what personally caused me to be a picky eater and to have anxiety about trying any new food. Speaking of anxiety, that brings me to my next struggle. I've always had moments in which I would get very anxious since I was a young child, as well as overthinking things. I feel that it was mostly caused by my autism because of how it causes my mind to work differently in certain ways. I haven't yet written a Google Doc about this one, but I'm planning on doing it next. Anyways, I've always had the issue of thinking too deeply about things that I shouldn't worry so much about. I would stress myself out by thinking about the worst possible case that could happen in any situation, and I still do that sometimes. Speaking of situations, like I said earlier in this video, I have trouble with things to happen when I'm not mentally prepared for it, and it always gives me anxiety when something happens unexpectedly. I've also always had the problem of being indecisive, and I would always think deeply about every minor decision, and being unable to decide something has also always made me anxious. More recently, I've been overthinking about every single thing that I wish I would have done differently, as well as every situation that I wish would have happened differently. And for many years now, when I do something actually wrong, I end up having a total panic attack and cry heavily with regret. I sometimes have unnecessary thoughts such as, I jinxed everything, and that perfectly describes my luck. I have received advice from some people to overcome my struggle with anxiety and overthinking as a whole. The old saying, which is to go with the flow, should be the most effective method. If I keep thinking too deeply about things in life, I'm going to have even more trouble paying attention than I already have. Yes, I had a lot of trouble with paying attention growing up. Now we're getting into a disadvantage that many people with a mental disability have a difficult time with. Although I have high functioning autism, there are still some ways in which my brain isn't fully functional, so I've always had trouble with paying attention to things, especially things that I wasn't particularly interested in. In the years from 2015 to 2021, sometimes my father would try to show me how to do something, but I would keep failing after being taught many times. I especially had a hard time learning how to do physical movements. He would end up getting frustrated about it. He usually felt sorry after he would get frustrated though. But because of that, it increased the difficulty to teach me how to do something, because I would worry that someone would get upset if I kept doing it the wrong way. Not paying attention has caused me to make some stupid mistakes, and a few major mistakes as well. I believe that I am intelligent, but there are certain things that I don't have much knowledge about that I would have if I paid more attention. Additionally, I've also grown up having problems with reading in school. I have always been very good at math and science, but reading was my weakness. My reading comprehension skills were far less than what they should have been in elementary and middle school, and I need a lot of help with it. Fortunately, I'm doing better than before now that I'm in high school. Now, although I still have a little bit of confusion with it. I feel that I'm overcoming my problem with learning and paying attention due to the development of my brain. Many of those with a learning disability also have a social disability, and that could be said about me too. Lastly, I'll be talking about another mental disadvantage I've always had. My most recent Google Doc, which I complete on June 6th, has the title Mental Disadvantages. And I talked about the previous struggle I went over in the first half, and I talked about this one in the other half. I've always been at a lower social level than that of the majority. It was never easy for me to openly start a conversation with someone who wasn't a family member or someone who was already a friend that I talked to. When I started 3rd grade in 2014, that was when I first started to have actual friends in school. But it was always them who made us friends with each other instead of me starting it. But it wasn't until 2018 that I started spending time with friends outside of school. And it was always the same 2 friends until 2022 when I started hanging out with 2 other ones. Something that made me always have a harder time socializing is that I would worry that the people who have a tendency to do or say something that bothers me would do those things. And that's partly why I normally felt uncomfortable in large groups. When it comes to communication, I've always had the habit of talking too quietly. I also frequently focus on only what I want to talk about, and I'm trying to work on that. It has always been difficult for me to say certain things to people as well, from sharing my thoughts and feelings, telling people what I want to have, and I even used to be that way for taking the initiative to say things like please and thank you to people. I feel that the most effective method I can use to improve my social and communication skills is simply to practice these things. I hope all of you watching this video liked my explanation on the things that I struggle with due to my autism. And I hope this video is helpful for anyone watching this who can relate to any of the things I mentioned. I am grateful that I have people in my life who I can talk to for help with these things. Goodbye, everyone.